Melanie Cross was a woman that no one would want to cross paths with if they knew what she was capable of. Her face remained calm, but if you looked closely, her eyes held a depth of determination and strength that few could truly understand. In her past, she had been a skilled Special Forces operative, trained in the most dangerous and covert operations across the globe. Every moment of her life had been spent in pursuit of justice, often in places where it was hard to come by. But now Melanie was no longer in the military. She had walked away from that life, leaving behind the horrors and sacrifices, seeking peace that she knew would always elude her. Instead, she chose a quieter existence, opening a self-defense school, a place where she could teach not just physical techniques, but also self-discipline, respect, and inner calm. To the outside world, she was just another woman in jeans and sneakers, but those who underestimated her didn't live to talk about it. Today was supposed to be an ordinary day. She had left the school early to head to the mall, wanting to pick up a gift for her nephew. She had no expectations of anything out of the ordinary, just the simple task of shopping. As she walked through the crowded aisles of the mall, the usual hum of the world around her, with shoppers and the sounds of store clerks interacting with customers, filled the air. But despite the apparent calm, there was something different in the air today. Melanie's instincts, honed through years of training, told her to be cautious. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, as if the very air in the mall had shifted. Still, she remained focused on her task, blocking out the unease and moving between stores. Meanwhile, Officer Bradley Stokes was on his routine patrol in the mall, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. Bradley was a man who had long since given up on any notion of fairness or justice. His worldview was narrow and clouded by his deep-seated prejudices, and his belief in his own superiority ran as deep as his ignorance. He had been a police officer for years, and while he had risen through the ranks, it was clear to anyone paying attention that his rise had more to do with his ability to enforce his personal biases than any actual skill or dedication to the job. He had been watching Melanie for a while, noticing the way she moved through the crowd with an unbothered air. His mind instantly went into overdrive. There was something about her that didn't sit right with him, something that made him think she didn't belong. Of course, he couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, but he didn't need to. To him, the fact that she was black and moving with such confidence was enough to label her as a potential threat. As he watched her approach the jewelry store, his internal suspicions began to grow. He couldn't place why, but something about her made him uneasy. As she stopped by the window, staring at the sparkling display of watches, he made a snap decision. She wasn't just browsing. To him, she was there for something more sinister, something that wasn't immediately visible but was felt in his gut. He didn't need proof. He didn't need a reason. It didn't matter that he had no idea who she was or what her purpose in the store might be. To him, she was a target, and that was all he needed to justify his next move. With his hand resting firmly on the handle of his gun, Bradley took a deep breath and started walking towards her, his mind already made up. He was about to teach her a lesson in submission, or so he thought. The way she stood there, seemingly unaware of his approach, only confirmed his suspicions. She didn't belong in that space, not in his eyes. Ma and Bradley called out, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the mall. Melanie turned slowly, her eyes locking onto his with a calm expression, a contrast to his tense demeanor. "You need to step aside. I need to check your bag." Melanie didn't flinch. She didn't feel the need to. She had been in situations like this before, though never in such a setting. She wasn't sure why he singled her out, but she had no intention of letting his actions get to her. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her tone steady, controlled, as though she was dealing with an inconvenience more than an actual threat. Bradley, however, wasn't looking for answers. He wasn't interested in reasoning. He had made his mind up, and now he was just going to follow through. His hand moved quickly, grabbing her bag and pulling it open without warning. Melanie's heart rate spiked, but she remained calm, knowing full well that this was a dangerous situation. She hadn't done anything wrong, but to Bradley, her very presence was enough to make her guilty. When he found nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that he could use as an excuse for his actions, Bradley's frustration began to boil over. He wasn't going to let her go without a fight. His eyes narrowed, and with a quick, aggressive motion, he reached for her arm, gripping it tightly and trying to force her away from the counter. Melanie's instincts kicked in the moment his hand touched her. She had been trained to anticipate every move, every attack. His mistake was thinking he could overpower her. She wasn't just a civilian. She wasn't just anyone. Melanie was not only prepared, she was a professional in every sense of the word. The second Bradley made his move, she spun, using his momentum against him, and with one swift motion, locked his arm behind his back. His struggle was futile. He couldn't believe how easily she had done it. His body thudded to the floor, his breath knocked out of him, the impact leaving him momentarily stunned. He stared up at her, bewildered and panicked. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She wasn't supposed to fight back. She wasn't supposed to resist him. Yet, here he was, defeated by a woman he had decided was beneath him. "Get off me," Bradley gasped, trying to twist free. But it was too late. The fight had already been lost. Melanie wasn't just a survivor. She wasn't just a woman who could hold her own. She had already won. And for Bradley, the humiliation was just beginning. Bradley Stokes, still on the floor, struggled to breathe as Melanie's grip remained firm on his arm. His mind raced, trying to process the situation. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't the way it was supposed to play out. He had been in countless confrontations, but none had escalated like this. He had expected compliance. He had expected her to cower, to become afraid the moment he approached, but instead, she had outwitted him at every turn, flipping the power dynamic in a matter of seconds. His body trembled in disbelief, not just from the physical pain but from the humiliation that burned through him like a fire. For the first time in years, Bradley felt vulnerable, exposed, and utterly defeated. As he lay on the cold floor of the mall, his eyes darted around, desperate for help, but the crowd was more of a distant witness than anything else. People were staring, some cautiously taking out their phones, but no one dared intervene. It was as if they had all seen this unfold before, the overconfident cop trying to intimidate someone weaker, only to be met with the unexpected. Melanie's face remained calm, collected, even as she held him down. She was in control of the situation, while Bradley was reduced to a man writhing in pain, beaten by his own arrogance. He gritted his teeth, trying to suppress the panic that was beginning to swell inside him. This wasn't supposed to be happening. He had always been in control, or at least he had always believed he was. This wasn't just about physical defeat, this was about his identity. He had worn the badge for years, believing it gave him power, and now here he was, at the mercy of a woman who was clearly more skilled, more capable, and more tuned into the present than he had ever realized. "Let me go," Bradley spat, his voice strained and shaky. He tried to push himself up, but Melanie's hold was ironclad, like a vice that refused to loosen. She didn't even seem to be exerting any effort. It was almost as if she wasn't using her strength at all. She was using her experience, her training, her awareness of every movement he might make. "You should have thought about that before you decided to attack me," Melanie replied coolly, her voice a steady force against his panicked outbursts. She wasn't yelling, wasn't demanding anything. There was no emotional charge in her words. She was just speaking the truth, and it only made Bradley's situation worse. He had misjudged her. Everything he had believed about himself was unraveling before his eyes. He had thought she was just another black woman walking through the mall, a person to assert dominance over, a target ripe for his brand of aggression. He had assumed that her race and gender made her an easy mark, someone who would be intimidated by his uniform, by his authority. He was wrong. And the more he realized it, the angrier he became, not just at her, but at himself, at the way he had let his preconceived notions cloud his judgment. The thought that he, a trained officer, could have been so easily outmaneuvered by someone who didn't even break a sweat was unacceptable to him. But the truth was, the deeper Bradley dug into the pit of his own mind, the more he realized that his frustration wasn't just about losing control in a confrontation. It was about his entire worldview, one that had been built on the belief that certain people didn't belong, that they were inferior, that they were meant to be put in their place. And here, in the middle of the mall, Melanie had shattered that. She wasn't afraid, she wasn't backing down, and she wasn't playing by his rules. The more he thought about it, the more he hated the fact that someone like her, someone who wasn't even wearing a uniform or holding a weapon, could bring him to his knees. The crowd was starting to stir, murmurs growing louder as people began to recognize what had just happened. Melanie was still standing over Bradley, keeping him immobilized without breaking a sweat. It was clear now that the balance of power had shifted completely. This wasn't just about a woman defending herself against an officer anymore, it had become a spectacle. The man who had once relied on his badge to dominate was now just another victim, exposed to the world in a way that was impossible to ignore. People were recording. The signs were already there. This was going to make the news, and Bradley knew it. Melanie, though, wasn't interested in fame or recognition. She was only interested in justice, in ensuring that Bradley knew exactly what it felt like to be on the receiving end of the very same oppression he had so often dished out to others. Her gaze remained cold, unyielding as she looked down at him, as though she could already see through his pathetic struggle. He could feel the weight of her stare, and it made him feel smaller, more insignificant than he ever had in his life. It wasn't just the physical restraint she had placed him under that made him realize his failure. It was the mental control she had asserted over him. For all his years of power, for all his training and experience, he had failed to anticipate the unexpected, and in doing so, had revealed just how fragile his authority was. For a moment, he thought about using his gun, but the thought of it was paralyzing. Not only because it would make the situation worse, but because it would be a coward's move, something he was no longer willing to resort to. The reality of his situation began to set in. If he pulled his weapon, there was a chance he could escalate things, and in front of all these people, it would be a death sentence for his career. It was already clear to everyone watching that he had made a mistake. "Just get off me," Bradley shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. This was no longer just a fight for control. This was his ego, his very identity as a police officer, shattering right in front of him. The realization was both humiliating and terrifying. What had once felt like an unassailable position was now crumbling under the weight of Melanie's calm, controlled presence. He was nothing more than a fallen man, exposed for his arrogance and prejudices. Melanie released her hold slightly, allowing him just enough room to breathe, though she didn't step back. She watched him struggle, taking in his obvious panic and desperation. His chest heaved as he gasped for air, his heart racing. He had never felt this weak, this helpless in his life, and it burned him to the core. "You really thought you could intimidate me, didn't you?" Melanie's voice was low but piercing, each word landing with precision. "This is how it feels, Bradley. This is the reality of what you've been doing all along." Bradley's hands shook as he tried to push himself up, but his legs felt like lead. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him now, could sense their judgment. But worst of all, He could feel his own loss, the loss of control, the loss of his authority, the loss of everything he had once believed to be his right. And now, in this moment, there was nothing he could do to change that. Melanie took a step back, finally allowing him to get up. But Bradley was no longer standing tall, no longer the man in charge. He was just another person in the crowd, another victim of his own biases, forced to confront the reality of his actions. And as he finally stood, struggling to regain his composure, one thing was certain: his life would never be the same again. The crowd, once quiet, had now started to whisper. Some looked on in disbelief, others with a sense of relief. Bradley had become a symbol of everything wrong with the system, and Melanie, in just a few moments, had become a symbol of what it meant to stand up against oppression, against abuse of power, and against everything that Bradley had come to represent. The moment had passed, but the damage had been done, and for Bradley, the battle had only just begun. Bradley struggled to regain his bearings as Melanie stepped back, allowing him to rise slowly from the cold floor. His body trembled from more than just the physical pain. It was the humiliation, the crushing weight of his ego that had shattered the facade he had built around himself for years. For the first time in his career, Bradley realized how fragile his sense of authority truly was. He had always relied on his badge, his uniform, and his power over others to keep people in line. But now, standing in front of Melanie, he felt like a powerless child, stripped of everything he had once taken for granted. Her calm composure was a stark contrast to his desperation. The way she moved, the way she held herself, was a reminder of everything he had failed to be. His eyes darted around the mall, desperate for some semblance of control. The crowd was still watching, some people pulling out their phones to record what had just happened. The whispers and murmurs filled the air like a dense fog. Bradley's fists clenched involuntarily, his knuckles turning white as the anger began to rise in him again. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't walk away from this, not after what had just happened. He had to do something, anything, to regain his dominance, to show that he was still in control. But his mind raced, his thoughts clouded with confusion and frustration. What could he do now? Melanie, however, remained composed. She didn't move a muscle, waiting for him to make his next move. She knew exactly what was coming next. She could see the anger brewing in Bradley's eyes, could almost feel the heat radiating off him as he tried to put together a plan. She was calm, almost detached, watching him struggle with his own sense of self-worth. This wasn't just a physical battle, it was a psychological one. And Melanie had already won. She didn't need to fight anymore, the battle was already over. But Bradley hadn't yet realized that. He wasn't ready to accept his defeat. Bradley's hand instinctively went for his holster, the familiar weight of his gun offering a false sense of security. It was a reflex, a conditioned response to feeling vulnerable, to feeling exposed. The moment his fingers brushed the cold metal of his weapon, his breath caught in his throat. He hesitated, his mind fighting with itself. He could draw his gun, assert his authority again, but he knew that doing so would only escalate the situation. He had already lost the crowd, lost any shred of respect that he had once commanded. If he pulled his weapon, it would only make things worse. But the thought of walking away, of leaving without having done anything to regain his control, was unbearable. "Get away from me," Bradley muttered, his voice hoarse, the words barely audible over the growing hum of voices around him. He took a step forward, trying to assert some semblance of power, but his body was weak, his movements sluggish. Melanie didn't flinch. She didn't even move. She just watched him, her eyes cold and unblinking. She wasn't intimidated. She wasn't scared. She was simply waiting for him to make his next mistake. Bradley lunged at her, his hands reaching out, trying to grab her by the arms. He wasn't thinking clearly anymore. The frustration, the shame, the desperation all fused together into a single, violent impulse. He wanted to hurt her, to make her feel the same fear he had hoped to instill in her earlier. But Melanie was ready. With a speed that Bradley couldn't even comprehend, she sidestepped his grasp, her body moving fluidly like water. Her hands shot out, grabbing his wrist with a vice-like grip. Before he could react, she twisted his arm behind his back, pushing him forward, using his own momentum against him. Bradley's body crashed into the hard tile floor with a sickening thud, the air knocked out of him as his face hit the ground. The crowd gasped in unison, some people even laughing in disbelief. Melanie didn't let go. She held him down, her knee pressing into his back, her hand firmly gripping his arm, keeping him pinned. Bradley's breath came in ragged gasps as he struggled beneath her. His pride, his arrogance, everything he had once believed about himself, was now lying in tatters at his feet. This wasn't just physical pain, this was the realization that he had been wrong, that everything he had done had been built on a foundation of lies and hatred. And Melanie, the woman he had hoped to dominate, was the one who had exposed it all. "Get off me," Bradley shouted, his voice thick with anger and humiliation. But Melanie didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her grip on him remained unyielding, her movements deliberate and precise. She wasn't trying to hurt him, she was simply showing him his place. She wasn't even out of breath. She had complete control of the situation. She wasn't struggling to subdue him, she was simply holding him in place, like a teacher holding a misbehaving student accountable. For a moment, there was silence. The crowd had stopped murmuring, their attention fully focused on the scene unfolding before them. Bradley was gasping for air, his face flushed with frustration, his body trembling. He had been trained to fight, to resist, but against someone who was trained to neutralize threats, he was nothing. His struggle was futile. "You've made your choice," Melanie said quietly, her voice carrying an icy calmness that sent a chill down his spine. "You chose to pick a fight, to use your badge and your uniform to intimidate me. But now you're the one who's weakened." Bradley's eyes widened in shock as he realized what she was saying. He had chosen to approach her with the mindset that his position of power would ensure his victory. He had thought that his uniform and his authority would make him untouchable, but now he was lying on the ground, powerless, unable to move, and forced to confront the consequences of his actions. This wasn't just a loss of control, it was a loss of identity. Melanie allowed him a few moments to catch his breath, to process the reality of the situation. She wasn't going to let him go yet. Not until she had made her point. And Bradley was starting to understand that he wasn't going to walk away from this confrontation unscathed. The pain, the humiliation, the defeat, it was all part of the lesson that Melanie had set out to teach him. "Get up," she said, her voice still calm, still measured. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout. She simply issued the command as if she was giving a direction to a child. Bradley gritted his teeth, his anger flaring up once more. He wasn't going to let her win. He wasn't going to let this woman break him. With all the strength he could muster, Bradley pushed himself off the ground, trying to stand, but his legs buckled beneath him. His body felt like lead. He was exhausted, both physically and mentally. He had been broken. And it wasn't just by the force of her movements. It was by the fact that he couldn't get back up, that the very thing he had relied on to stay in control had been ripped away from him. Melanie didn't help him. She didn't offer him a hand. She simply watched as he struggled, her eyes never leaving him. "Get up," she repeated, her voice still calm, still unwavering. Bradley's frustration boiled over, and with a final, desperate push, he managed to get to his feet. But he wasn't the man he had been moments ago. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something else, something that felt almost like fear. He had been humbled. He had lost. And in that moment, the weight of his defeat was more than he could bear. Melanie stepped back, finally allowing him the space to stand on his own. But she wasn't done with him yet. Not by a long shot. She was going to make sure he understood the full extent of his mistake, and for that, she needed him to feel it in every part of his being. Bradley stood there, trembling with rage and humiliation, his eyes flicking nervously around the mall, as if waiting for someone to come to his rescue. But no one was coming. The moment had passed. The crowd had seen it all. And Melanie knew that nothing would ever be the same for him again. "You can go now," Melanie said, her voice cold. "But remember this, I won't let anyone disrespect me, not even a cop." Bradley stood there for a moment longer, his chest heaving, his mind racing, but the truth was clear. He had been thoroughly beaten, not just in body, but in spirit. He had thought he could control her, intimidate her, break her. But instead, it was he who had been broken. Without a word, he turned and walked away, his steps unsteady, his mind a blur. The crowd watched as he disappeared into the distance, but for Melanie, the battle was already over. She had won, and nothing would ever be the same again. As Bradley stumbled away from Melanie, trying to collect himself after the humiliation, the adrenaline that had once surged through his veins now felt like an empty pit in his stomach. He could barely keep his thoughts in order as the reality of what had just happened settled over him. The pain from the blows and the shame of losing control was something he had never experienced before. His confidence, once an unshakable force, had been shattered in mere moments. The crowd in the mall, once oblivious to him as a figure of authority, now watched him with a mixture of pity and disbelief. Bradley had always prided himself on his ability to command respect, but all of that had evaporated in the face of Melanie's unyielding strength and calm composure. As he made his way toward the exit, each step felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Outside, the air was thick with the weight of what had just transpired. The cool breeze hit Bradley's face, but it did little to clear the fog that clouded his mind. He wasn't sure what had happened. How had he let it come to this? The images of Melanie's cold, unbothered expression, the way she effortlessly controlled his every move, kept replaying in his mind. He had been an officer for over a decade, had dealt with criminals, had been in countless confrontations, but never like this. This wasn't a fight. This was something entirely different. It was personal. And for the first time, Bradley wasn't just the one in charge, he was the one who had been broken. He walked a few more steps, his hands shaking, his mind racing. He couldn't let this go. Not like this. Not after what had happened in the mall. Something had to be done. His anger boiled inside him, simmering beneath the surface. He was humiliated, but he couldn't let Melanie get away with it. No, he wouldn't just walk away from this. He couldn't. If he did, it would mean everything he stood for was meaningless. Meanwhile, back inside the mall, Melanie stood motionless for a few moments, watching as Bradley left. Her gaze was cold, but it wasn't out of spite or anger. She wasn't the type to hold grudges. She had taught him a lesson, one that would resonate with him far longer than any physical pain could. She had neutralized the threat. But Melanie knew that the real battle wasn't over. The physical altercation might have ended, but what followed was the part that truly mattered. Bradley wouldn't let this go easily. He would fight back, and she had to be prepared for that. The question now was, how far would he go? Would he escalate things, or would he slink away, defeated? Melanie felt the tension in the air, the same tension she had felt when she first noticed Bradley stalking her across the mall. She had known from the start that he wouldn't just walk away. He wasn't that type of man, the kind who needed control, who thrived on asserting his dominance over others, especially those he deemed inferior. But now, as she stood in the middle of the mall, Knowing that Bradley was gone, she allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. She had fought back not just for herself, but for all the people like her, the ones who had been pushed around, dismissed, and belittled for far too long. This wasn't just a victory for her, this was a small but meaningful win against an oppressive system. But even as she thought about the justice of the situation, her mind shifted back to the path ahead. She couldn't allow herself to become complacent. Bradley's actions weren't isolated, they were part of a larger, insidious web of prejudices that ran deep, not just in police departments but in society as a whole. He would either seek revenge or he would collapse inwards, consumed by the fact that he had lost. Either way, Melanie knew that it wasn't enough to win this one battle. The war was much bigger than just a single confrontation in a shopping mall. As she left the mall, the weight of what she had just done began to sink in. She wasn't sure what the aftermath would be, but she had been in enough dangerous situations to know that any action had its consequences. Bradley might be a low-level cop, but there were people above him, people who might decide to back him up, people who might make her life harder. She couldn't trust that this would simply fade into the background. She would have to prepare for whatever came next. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from her partner, Luke. She quickly glanced at the message, "Everything okay?" Her finger hovered over the screen for a moment as she contemplated how much to say. Luke knew her well enough to understand that she wouldn't say anything unless it was important. But this was something that would be hard to explain in a simple message. She typed back, "It's fine, just a little situation. I'll talk to you later." She put the phone back in her pocket, not wanting to dwell on the details just yet. She needed to clear her head. Outside, the sun had begun to dip behind the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Melanie inhaled deeply, letting the fresh evening air fill her lungs. She had always loved the stillness of the evening, a time when the world seemed to breathe, to slow down for a moment before the chaos of the night took over. It was her favorite time to reflect, to think about the world she had left behind and the one she had chosen to step into. But tonight, as she walked through the streets, the weight of the day's events lingered on her shoulders. She had to keep moving. She couldn't stop now, not when there was so much at stake. Meanwhile, Bradley's anger had only grown since leaving the mall. He hadn't even made it to his car before he was pulling out his phone, dialing a number he knew by heart. The moment the call connected, he didn't wait for pleasantries. "I need backup," he growled, his voice strained. "Something happened at the mall. A woman. She's out of control. She took me down, humiliated me in front of everyone. I want her off the streets." The person on the other end of the line was quiet for a moment. Then came the response he had been hoping for. "We'll handle it. Just stay calm. Don't make any rash decisions." But Bradley wasn't about to stay calm. The humiliation had been too much. He wasn't just going to let her walk away without facing the consequences. There were people he could call, people who owed him favors, people who could help him get what he wanted. He wasn't going to let this woman get away with it. His mind was already racing, planning his next move. This wasn't just a personal vendetta anymore. This was about showing everyone that he was still the one in charge. He was going to make sure that Melanie learned the hard way that there were consequences for defying him. And if it took more than just words, then so be it. She had embarrassed him in front of his peers, and now it was time to return the favor. Back at home, Melanie felt a strange mix of exhaustion and adrenaline coursing through her body. She had dealt with difficult situations before, but this felt different. She wasn't just defending herself, she was challenging the very system that had oppressed her for so long. But deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. The battle ahead would not be easy. Bradley would not let this go, and she had to be ready for whatever came next. She couldn't afford to be complacent. The world didn't work that way. Not for people like her. She didn't know how long she'd been pacing back and forth when her phone buzzed again. This time, the message was from a different number. It wasn't Luke, and it wasn't Luke, and it wasn't anyone she recognized. The message read, "We know who you are. Don't think you've won." Her blood ran cold. This was just the beginning. Bradley was already a man on the edge, but as the evening wore on, it became clear that he wasn't going to let this incident fade into the background. Every part of his being screamed for retribution. The pain in his body had subsided, but the sting of his humiliation was as sharp as ever. As soon as he got home, he locked the door behind him and sat down, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts, none of which were particularly rational. His heart was still racing, his pulse pounding with the anger that refused to die down. He tried to process what had happened, but all he could see was Melanie's cold, impassive face as she had expertly taken him down in the middle of the mall. The way she hadn't even broken a sweat. The way she had made him feel like nothing. He stared at his phone, his fingers twitching as he held it in his hand. The texts he had received only fueled the fire inside him. "We know who you are. Don't think you've won." The words seemed to echo in his head, mocking him, reminding him that this was far from over. Whoever had sent that message, whoever was behind this, had made a mistake. He wasn't the type of man who took things lying down. They wanted to mess with him? Fine. They would get what was coming to them. Bradley's first instinct was to call for backup, but he didn't want to involve anyone yet. Not yet. He knew that whatever he did next had to be calculated, strategic. He wasn't going to just throw everything he had into the fire without making sure he had a plan. But right now he couldn't think clearly. His emotions were clouding his judgment. Melanie had exposed him, and that wasn't something he could live with. He had been a cop long enough to know how these things worked, and one thing he knew for sure was that if people thought he was weak, if they thought he could be humiliated in front of everyone, then they would start to see him differently. His reputation was everything, and it was hanging by a thread. The anger began to turn into something more focused, more dangerous. He couldn't let her get away with it. Melanie had made a statement, one that couldn't go unchallenged. She had shamed him, and he couldn't allow that. He had to make her understand who was truly in control here. His mind was already spinning with plans, each more violent than the last. But in the back of his mind, there was a voice, a nagging reminder that this wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't just about revenge. He could feel the weight of his badge on his chest, but this wasn't a battle for justice, this was a battle for pride. Meanwhile, Melanie was still processing the events that had unfolded. Her body ached from the altercation, the physical tension still evident in her muscles, but she had already started to prepare herself for what was coming next. She had been through enough in her life to know that any action had its consequences, and it wasn't going to end with a victory in the mall. Bradley would not let this go. She had walked away from the confrontation, but her mind had never really left the scene. As she stood in the small apartment that she called home, she tried to focus on what was important. The messages she had received were disturbing, but they weren't unexpected. Bradley was not the type to be defeated easily, and she knew that if he was still breathing, then this was far from over. She took a long, slow breath, trying to center herself. The events of the day had been a reminder of how much more there was to this fight than she had initially realized. The text that had come after her confrontation with Bradley wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration. Someone out there had resources, and someone out there was watching her. The stakes had just been raised, and now it was a matter of survival. She knew that if she didn't act quickly, if she didn't stay ahead of the game, then she would become the next target. The problem was, she wasn't sure who her real enemy was. Bradley, yes, but who was backing him? Who were the forces behind the system that allowed men like him to feel invincible? It wasn't just about one cop anymore, it was about a culture of entitlement, power, and control. The deeper she went into the situation, the more she realized that she wasn't just dealing with a personal vendetta. This was part of something bigger, and if she didn't confront it head-on, she would be swallowed up by it. But there was no time to waste on doubt. The phone buzzed again, this time from an unknown number. She hesitated before answering, knowing that the person on the other end could be anyone. Melanie came the voice on the other end, cold and detached. "You've made a big mistake." It was a voice she didn't recognize, but the words were clear. Whoever this was, they were connected. She remained silent, not wanting to give away any information that could be used against her. "I'm not the one who made a mistake," she finally replied, her voice steady despite the growing tension in her chest. "Your boy made that mistake, not me." A laugh echoed through the phone. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. Bradley's just the beginning. We have resources you don't even know about. If you think this is over, you're wrong. This is just the start." Melanie felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. It wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. The game had just changed. Whoever this was, they weren't afraid of her. They were used to getting what they wanted, and they were willing to go to any lengths to make sure that she was taken down. The voice on the other end continued, its tone growing colder. "You've upset the wrong people, Melanie. You're not as invincible as you think. There's always a price to pay for making enemies like this." She wanted to respond, to challenge the person on the other end, but she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she took a deep breath and tried to steady her racing heart. This was it. This was the turning point. She had known this moment would come, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure what her next move should be. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice sharp. "And neither are you." There was a brief silence before the voice on the other end chuckled again, the sound sending a chill down her spine. "We'll see about that," it replied before the call abruptly ended. Melanie stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle around her. The adrenaline that had been pumping through her veins just moments before now began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of urgency. She had to act quickly. She couldn't wait for Bradley to make the first move. She had to take control of the situation before it spiraled out of her hands. But she also knew that this wasn't just about Bradley anymore. The message was clear: she was fighting a system now. A system that wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. And if she wanted to survive, she needed to start thinking like a fighter, not a victim. She had been trained to endure, to fight back when it mattered, and now, more than ever, she needed those skills to keep herself alive. Bradley was angry. That much was obvious. And when Bradley was angry, people got hurt. But Melanie wasn't just any person. She was prepared, and this time she wasn't going to be caught off guard. The battle lines had been drawn, and Melanie knew that there was no turning back. The next few days, perhaps even hours, would determine the course of the conflict ahead, and no matter what happened, she couldn't afford to lose. The tension that had been building since the mall incident finally reached a boiling point. Melanie's senses were heightened, every nerve in her body on edge. The phone call from earlier that night, the threats made, all of it was now real. The shadows that loomed behind Bradley's anger had taken on a shape, a dangerous one. She knew she wasn't just dealing with a disgruntled cop anymore. There were forces at play that were far larger than her initial confrontation, and they were willing to do whatever it took to silence her. The next few hours felt like an eternity. Melanie spent most of that time pacing back and forth in her small apartment, her mind never fully still. The walls seemed to close in on her as the weight of what was coming settled in. She had always been able to predict her enemy's next moves. had always been one step ahead, but this time she wasn't so sure. The people behind Bradley, whoever they were, had made it clear that they weren't going to stop until she was dealt with. She wasn't sure how far they would go, but she knew one thing for certain: if she didn't act, she wouldn't just be fighting for justice anymore, she would be fighting for her survival. As the night deepened, her thoughts kept drifting back to that moment in the mall, the feeling of Bradley's body under her control, the way she had effortlessly neutralized him. It hadn't been about showing off her strength. It had been about sending a message. But even as she replayed that moment in her head, she knew it wasn't enough. Bradley wasn't the real threat. He had been a pawn, a puppet for something much darker. And now it was time to take the fight to them. Melanie knew she had to act quickly. The longer she waited, the more likely it was that they would make their move before she could defend herself. She couldn't afford to be reactive anymore. She needed to be proactive. And to do that, she had to find out who was really behind this, who was pulling the strings and orchestrating the threats. She grabbed her phone and pulled up the contact list for her old network. These were the people she had trusted during her time in the field, the ones who had helped her out of tight spots more times than she cared to count. She didn't hesitate. Her fingers moved quickly as she typed out a message to Luke, her most reliable ally. "I need intel. Now." She sent the message and waited, her eyes flicking to the door, then to the small window of her apartment. The streets outside were quiet, but that silence was unnerving. The world outside seemed to have frozen, holding its breath as she prepared for the storm that was coming. She wasn't sure what kind of help Luke would be able to provide, but she knew he had the resources to dig deeper into the situation. She had to find out who was behind the threats before they could make their next move. The phone buzzed minutes later. Luke had responded. "I've got something. There's a name that keeps coming up: Damien Shaw. High up in the ranks, private contractor, dirty dealings." Melanie's heart sank. She had heard of Shaw before, in whispers, in the darkest corners of her world. A man like him operated in the shadows, pulling strings from behind the scenes. He was a master at manipulation, using people like Bradley as pawns to do his dirty work, then disposing of them once they outlived their usefulness. Shaw wasn't someone you could just confront head-on. He was the type of person who had people killed for less. She had never crossed paths with Shaw, but she had heard enough to know that he wasn't someone who could be reasoned with. The threat had escalated far beyond what she had anticipated. This wasn't just about a cop who had overstepped his bounds. This was a full-blown operation, a web of corruption that stretched far beyond her current understanding. Melanie's mind raced as she absorbed the information. The knowledge that Shaw was involved changed everything. She couldn't just play the game anymore. She would have to outsmart him, take him down, but without getting herself caught in his web. She had worked with people like Shaw before, and she knew one thing: people like him didn't stop until they got what they wanted. But they also underestimated their enemies. Melanie wasn't the type to be intimidated, not anymore. She had been trained to fight smarter, not harder. Shaw might think he was untouchable, but she wasn't about to let him think he could control her. Luke's message also mentioned something else. "I've arranged for an informant. They're meeting tomorrow night at the old docks. I don't know how reliable they are, but it's a lead." Melanie knew that if there was even a chance to get ahead of Shaw and his people, she had to take it. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat, pulling it tightly around her shoulders. The cool night air greeted her as she stepped outside, and for a moment it almost felt like everything was normal. But she knew it wasn't. She was stepping into a dangerous game, one where the stakes were much higher than she had ever imagined. The old docks were abandoned, the perfect place for shady deals and hidden meetings. The silence of the place had a certain weight to it, as though the very air carried the remnants of secrets that had been buried long ago. Melanie's boots crunched against the gravel as she made her way through the deserted area, her hand resting on the concealed weapon at her side. She didn't know who or what she would face tonight, but she was ready for anything. As she approached the meeting spot, she saw a figure waiting in the shadows. The man's posture was rigid, his hands clasped in front of him. He didn't move when he saw her, but Melanie could tell he was assessing her, trying to determine whether she was a threat. She could do the same with him. But right now she needed answers. She couldn't afford to waste time. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger. There was no one else in sight, but that didn't mean the meeting was private. Shaw's people were known to be everywhere, watching and waiting. She had to be careful. The man in front of her cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "You're the one they're looking for, aren't you?" he said, his voice low and cautious. "Melanie Cross, the one who took down Bradley." "I didn't take him down," Melanie replied, her tone flat. "I just showed him the truth." The man nodded slightly, as though he understood what she meant. "Shaw's not going to let you walk away from this," he said, his voice tinged with an undercurrent of fear. "He's already sent people after you. He'll use anyone he can to make sure you're dealt with." "Who else is involved?" Melanie asked, her voice sharp. She needed answers, and she needed them now. The man hesitated, his eyes darting nervously. He wasn't sure how much to trust her, but he also knew that if he didn't give her something, she would walk away and Shaw's people would find him just as easily. "There's more," the man finally said. "Shaw's connections go deep. He's involved with people in high places. There's no way to stop him unless you get to him first." He paused, swallowing hard. "But be careful, he's always 2 steps ahead." The tension in the air thickened as the realization settled in. Shaw wasn't just some random criminal mastermind. He was part of a much larger network of power that Melanie had barely begun to scratch the surface of. Melanie nodded, taking in the man's words. "I'll deal with him. Don't worry about me." The man didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. "You better. Because if you don't, Shaw won't just kill you. He'll destroy everything you've worked for." With that, the informant turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Melanie standing in the cold, alone once again. She had the information she needed, but now the real battle began. Shaw was a force to be reckoned with, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. But for Melanie, this was personal now, and she was ready to take him down, no matter what it took. The night felt like it was closing in on Melanie as she moved swiftly through the streets, her mind racing with everything she had learned. The air around her felt thick, heavy with the weight of the battle she was about to face. Her thoughts were no longer scattered, as they had been earlier in the day. Now there was only one thing on her mind sure. She had gathered everything she needed, pieced together the puzzle of corruption and power, and now it was time to make him pay for everything he had done. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the silence that had settled in around her. She pulled it out and saw that it was a message from Luke. His words were direct, urgent. "They're moving on you. Get ready." Melanie's heart skipped a beat. She had known this was coming, but the reality of it hit her with full force. They had wasted no time. Bradley, Shaw's people, they had all been gearing up for something much bigger, and now it was her turn to act and act fast. There was no room for hesitation. Not now. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was taking the fight to them. And she wasn't about to lose. With every step she took, she could feel the calm, collected persona she had honed over the years slipping into place. The adrenaline coursing through her veins was no longer the anxious kind. It was the focused, determined kind. Her instincts were sharp, and her mind was clear. She had a plan. Shaw had to be eliminated, and she knew exactly how to do it. But first, she had to survive the night. Melanie made her way to the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The place had been a hub for Shaw's activities for years, a dark corner where deals were made, plans were executed, and lives were ruined. She had known from the beginning that this was where the final confrontation would happen. She had watched Shaw's people operate from the shadows, but now it was time to step into the light, to face them head on. No more sneaking around. No more hiding. The building loomed ahead, its rusted metal walls barely visible in the dark. She reached into her jacket and pulled out the small piece of equipment she had prepared earlier, a silenced pistol. It wasn't the weapon she preferred, but in a situation like this, it was exactly what she needed. She had made sure to be strategic in her approach, thinking through every possible outcome, every possible threat. The plan was simple: get in, neutralize the people who stood in her way, and get to shore. As she approached the entrance, her senses went into overdrive. Every step she took was calculated, every movement deliberate. She didn't need to rush. Rushing would only make her a target. Her years of training had taught her the value of patience, of timing. She knew that every second could make the difference between success and failure. The door creaked as she pushed it open, the sound seeming to echo through the silence of the warehouse. She stepped inside, her boots hitting the concrete floor with a dull thud. Her eyes darted around, scanning for any sign of movement. The warehouse was dark, but the faint light from the streetlights outside cast long shadows across the room. She moved quickly, blending into the darkness, her body low to the ground as she navigated the maze of crates and old equipment. She could feel the eyes on her, though no one had yet revealed themselves. They were watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. But Melanie didn't make mistakes. Not when the stakes were this high. Her breath slowed, her heartbeat steady. She had no fear. This was what she had trained for: to stay calm, to stay focused, even when the world around her seemed ready to explode. She kept moving, her steps silent, her presence almost ghostly. The shadows were her allies now. She was the hunter, and they were the prey. As she rounded a corner, she saw a group of men standing near a stack of crates, talking in low voices. They didn't notice her approach until it was too late. Without hesitation, Melanie drew her weapon, and in one fluid motion, she took down two of them with precise shots to the chest. The others were quick to react, pulling their weapons, but they were disorganized, panicked. She had the advantage. With a quick roll to the side, she popped up and took down another two, their bodies crumpling to the ground without a sound. The last man standing tried to make a run for it, but he was no match for Melanie's speed. She was already on him, her hand on his throat before he could even think to raise his weapon. "Where is Shaw?" she demanded, her voice low and lethal. The man's eyes widened in fear, and for a moment it seemed as though he might betray his boss. "Downstairs," he muttered, his voice shaky. "He's waiting for you." Melanie didn't waste another second. She let go of the man's throat and watched him scramble to his feet, but she didn't need to kill him. He had given her all the information she needed. Shaw was waiting for her. She knew it was time to end this. She made her way downstairs, her footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell. Her grip on the pistol tightened as she descended, her body moving with the precision of a predator. This was it. The final showdown. The moment that would either end her fight or define her victory. The basement was dark, but the faint sound of voices carried through the space. Melanie's heart rate didn't increase. She wasn't nervous. She was ready. She crouched low, her body pressed against the cold stone wall as she peered around the corner. And there he was, Damien Shaw. He was seated at a desk, surrounded by several men. His back was turned, and he didn't seem to notice Melanie's presence. She didn't waste time. She moved in swiftly, her gun aimed at Shaw's head as she stepped into the room. The men around him froze, their hands instinctively going for their weapons. But Shaw, ever the master of control, raised his hand to stop them. "Hold on," he said, his voice smooth, almost calm. "So it's you. I wondered when you'd show up." Melanie's finger hovered over the trigger. "This ends tonight, Shaw." He smirked, his eyes gleaming with something dark and calculating. "You think it's that simple? You think you can just walk in here and take me down? You have no idea what you're up against." Her lips curled into a cold smile. "I'm not here for your games. I'm here to end this." The men in the room reached for their guns, but before they could draw, Melanie's shots rang out, two of them collapsing immediately. Shaw remained seated, his expression unfazed, though the tension in the room had shifted. He knew he was cornered, but he wasn't willing to go down without a fight. "You're making a mistake," Shaw said, his voice almost soothing. "You don't know what you're doing. You're walking into a war you can't win." "I've already won," Melanie replied, her voice steady, unyielding. "And now, it's time to finish it." The next moments were a blur. Shaw's remaining men charged at her, but Melanie's movements were quick, precise. She dispatched them with swift, calculated shots. As the last man fell to the ground, Shaw stood up, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and rage. "You think you've won, but you haven't," Shaw spat, his voice full of venom. "There's always someone above you. You think you can just wipe us out? You can't." Melanie didn't flinch. She had heard it all before. She took a step forward, her gun aimed directly at Shaw's chest. "This ends now," she said, her voice like ice. And with a single pull of the trigger, Shaw's reign of terror was over. The room fell into silence. The battle was won. But Melanie knew this was only one chapter of a much larger story. Shaw's empire had crumbled, but the system he had helped create would continue to operate. It wasn't over. Not for her. Not for the people who had suffered because of men like Shaw. But for now, in this moment, she could breathe. She had won, and she wasn't going to stop until the rest of the fight was won as well.